Humans are a very unique animal. We're kind of a hybrid generalist species. We're decent at just about everything. We can sprint, we can jump and throw, but maybe most notably, we have pretty much the best endurance of any animal on the planet. The average human has about an even mix of slow and fast twitch muscle fibers, but most other animals have mostly fast twitch. So oversimplifying things, slow twitch fibers allow for endurance and fast twitch fibers produce speed and power. To use an example, chimpanzees are smaller than humans, but they're about 35% stronger, mostly because they have more fast twitch fibers than we do. So humans have very good endurance because of our slow twitch fibers, but we're not as quick as fast twitch animals like cats or as strong as fast twitch animals like chimps. But we can actually shift muscle fiber types to become more fast twitch, and that's what this video is about. I'm going to talk about how we can max out our fast twitch muscle fibers so that we can become as fast and powerful as possible. First, let's cover some of the basic muscle fiber physiology. Muscle fibers contain contractile proteins called actin and myosin, and these are the proteins that allow the muscle to contract. This is why we eat protein in our diets, so that it can be broken down into amino acids and made into these actin and myosin proteins so that our muscles can get bigger and stronger. The actin and myosin proteins are arranged in little units called sarcomeres. There are lots of sarcomeres, one after the other, within the muscle fiber. The myosin filament has little heads on it that attach to the actin filament and basically pull it. The actin slides past the myosin as it's pulled by the myosin heads, and the whole sarcomere shortens. And this happens all throughout the muscle fiber, and the result is the muscle fiber shortens. And if it's a really intense contraction, then all the muscle fibers within the muscle contract and the whole muscle shortens. And what we're interested in is the heavy chain of the myosin protein. That's the blue part on this picture. The yellow and the red parts are myosin light chains, so we don't need to think about them. There are 3 different types of myosin heavy chain. Type 1, slow oxidative. Type 2A, fast oxidative, and type 2X, fast glycolytic. To keep things simple, I'll just refer to each type of muscle fiber as type 1, type 2A, or type 2X, based on the main form of myosin heavy chain that it contains. At one end of the spectrum are the type 1, slow oxidative muscle fibers. These use oxidative or aerobic metabolism to produce slow contractions at a low level of force over a long period of time. So they're used for things like jogging or walking, where the intensity is low and the duration tends to be quite long. They take a long time to fatigue because they're very efficient at using oxygen to generate ATP through oxidative metabolism in their mitochondria, but they don't produce much force. And they also don't have much potential to grow. Their size is maxed out pretty quickly once you start training properly. Next, we have the 2 kinds of fast twitch muscle fibers, or type 2 muscle fibers. In the middle of the speed spectrum are the type 2A fibers, which are fast oxidative muscle fibers. Like type 1, these also use mostly oxidative metabolism to produce ATP, but the contractions they generate are faster and more forceful than type 1 fibers. And because they use oxidative metabolism, they still take a while to fatigue, but they're not as fatigue resistant as type 1 fibers. So think middle distance running, like a 1500 meter race, something like that. And all the way at the fast end of the spectrum are the type 2X fibers. These are fast glycolytic muscle fibers that use anaerobic metabolism, also known as glycolysis, to produce ATP very quickly. They produce fast, very forceful contractions, but they fatigue very quickly. So think sprinting a very short distance for like less than 10 seconds, or a snatch in Olympic weightlifting, or a jump or a throw. Very quick, very powerful movements. And type 2 fibers have the most potential for hypertrophy. These are the fibers that you want to be recruiting when you're doing bodybuilding style workouts. The proportion of fast and slow twitch fibers varies between each muscle. Most muscles have about an even mix of fast and slow twitch fibers, but the exact proportions vary. The soleus muscle in the calves and the biceps femoris in the hamstrings are mostly slow twitch in most people. And the triceps, the rectus femoris in the quads, brachioradialis in the forearm, the pecs, and the vastus lateralis in the quads, all of those tend to be quite fast twitch. But again, keep in mind the exact proportions can be very different in different people. Credit to Chris Beardsley at Strength and Conditioning Research for this lovely graph and a lot of the information in this video. I cannot recommend this guy's free Patreon enough. Seriously, one of the best exercise science resources I've ever come across. I'll have a link in the description so you can check that out. And side note for strength and hypertrophy training, the fiber type of a muscle affects how quickly the muscle can recover. Muscles which are more fast twitch fatigue more easily and they take longer to recover. Probably because fast twitch fibers have fewer mitochondria in them, which makes them more susceptible to damage because the mitochondria struggle to clear the calcium ions that build up in the muscle during exercise. And those calcium ions are what lead to muscle damage. So fast twitch fibers take longer to recover because they get damaged more easily. Muscles which are more slow twitch recover more quickly, probably because they've got lots of mitochondria, about 2 or 3 times more than fast twitch fibers, and these mitochondria in slow twitch fibers are better at clearing calcium ions. So this affects the volume and the frequency that you should use for each muscle. Slow twitch muscles recover more quickly, so you can train them a bit more often and you can get away with slightly higher volume. And fast twitch muscles recover more slowly, so you can't train them quite as often and you should probably use slightly lower volume. So different muscles have different levels of fast and slow twitch fibers, but individual people also have different proportions. Most people have about an even mix of fast and slow twitch fibers overall, but the exact proportions will vary based on genetics and activity and many other things. An average untrained person might have something like 50% type 1, 35% type 2A, and 15% type 2X. But there are definitely some outliers. Elite sprinters tend to have more fast twitch fibers than normal, which is why they are able to run so fast, especially their type 2X fibers. This study found that in this world champion sprinter, 24% of all his muscle fibers were type 2X, which is very high, and 71% of all his muscle fibers were some type of fast twitch, which is crazy high, because in a normal person it's like 50%. And on the other hand, elite endurance athletes have more slow twitch fibers than normal, making them very good at running long duration races. They're very resistant to fatigue. In this study, the elite runners had an average of 79% slow twitch fibers, which again is crazy high considering the average person has like 50% slow twitch fibers. So chances are you have about an even mix of both fast and slow twitch fibers. You might naturally be a little more fast or a little more slow twitch just based on genetics. People who have done some kind of physical training tend to lose their type 2X fibers in favor of type 2A if it's a sport that involves some strength component, or type 1 if it's an endurance sport. So untrained people actually have more type 2X fibers than most athletes besides like sprinters and power athletes. If you clicked on this video, you probably want to develop your fast twitch abilities, your explosiveness, sprint speed, that kind of thing. These fiber type shifts are controlled by a bunch of molecular signaling pathways and the expression of certain genes, but I won't get into that in this video. If you want to read a bit more about it, here is a nice review. So let's get into how to shift towards fast twitch fibers. I won't get your hopes up too high. You can only produce a pretty small shift, maybe adding an extra 5 to 15% to your total type 2X fiber percentage. So if you currently have 10% type 2X fibers, you might be able to get to 15, 20, maybe 25% with smart, dedicated training over a long period of time. But that is a very substantial increase. And of course, your max potential for type 2X fibers will be limited by your genetics. Most of this is going to be about reversing the existing loss of type 2X fibers or preventing further loss. You're not going to be able to get crazy high proportions of type 2X fibers. Percentages over like 35 or 40% are basically never seen. We are mostly just preserving type 2X fibers as much as possible and recovering what we've lost as much as possible. And also keep in mind, guys, this video is about increasing speed. It's not about maximizing hypertrophy. The things I'm recommending here are not the best way to produce hypertrophy. They're the best way to increase type 2X fibers so that you can get faster. If you do want bigger muscles though, check out one of my bodybuilding programs, which I'll have linked in the description. The first thing you want to keep in mind is to avoid slow velocities in training. In the gym, that basically means slow bar speed. This can happen either when the weight is very heavy, so you're struggling to move it, or when you're approaching failure towards the end of a set, so the reps slow down because you're starting to really struggle. Training heavy is good for strength, and training close to failure is good for hypertrophy, but the slow movement speeds involved in both of those will cause a shift from type 2X to the slightly slower type type 2A, and this can happen pretty quickly. Within 6 weeks of a 3-day per week heavy strength program, your triceps can go from 33% type 2X to 19%. The program in this study was 5 sets of 3 rep maxes in the bench press, with 6 minutes of rest in between sets. So that is very heavy and it's pretty high volume. Each one of those reps would be pretty slow. It would have a slow velocity because it's so heavy. And in this same study, the other experimental group did just 1 day a week of heavy strength training with that same bench workout. And instead of doing 2 more days of that bench workout, they did 2 days of lightweight explosive movements. And this group saw no change in the type 2X fibers, a gain in the proportion of type 2A fibers from 47% to 62%, and a loss in the proportion of type 1 fibers from 18% to 9%. So this group that did some explosive movements instead of heavy lifting, they reduced their type 1 fibers, increased their type 2A fibers, and maintained their type 2X fibers. Remember, the other group lost a lot of their type 2X fibers. So this more explosive group are probably going to have bigger, stronger, and faster muscles because they now have more fast twitch fibers, but they will have lost some of their muscular endurance because they lost some slow twitch fibers. And I'm speculating now, if they had just done high velocity lightweight movements, they might even have seen slight gains in type 2X fibers if they hadn't included that day of heavy benching, because that bench workout would have been very fatiguing and would have sent some kind of signal within a cell to shift away from type 2X fibers. But it just wasn't strong enough in this case to cause a significant shift. So the takeaway here, if you want more type 2X fibers, keep the movement velocity high, stay far away from muscle failure, and avoid very heavy weights, or at least don't lift super heavy all the time. Along with preserving type 2X fibers, avoiding failure also improves early phase rate of force development, which is basically explosiveness, and it also improves sprint speed. And those two things can probably be at least partly explained by the higher proportion of type 2X fibers that you see resulting from avoiding failure. The second big thing to keep in mind is going to be to use lower volume. So higher volume is very good for strength and hypertrophy up to a point, but it's actually bad for speed. In this study, higher volumes of resistance training to failure reduces type 2X fibers more than lower volumes to failure. The higher volume group did 6 sets per muscle 3 days a week, so a total of 18 sets for each muscle every week, which is very high volume. And the low volume group did 2 sets per muscle 3 days a week, so 6 sets for each muscle every week. The higher volume group lost more type 2X fibers than the low volume group. The low volume group here still lost some type 2X fibers, possibly because they were training to failure or very close to it, using 10 rep maxes, 8 rep max, 7 rep max, or 90% of those rep maxes. And as I've just discussed, training close to failure means slow rep speed, which means you're losing type 2X fibers. So if you want to avoid losing type 2X fibers, you need to avoid muscle failure and use lower volumes. And there's some more evidence for this. Low volume training, so 3 sets twice per week for a total of 6 sets per week, has also been shown to be better for improving jumping height and early rate of force development, which, like I said, is explosiveness. That is better in comparison to moderate or high volume training. And this study also provides evidence that low volume maintains type 2X muscle fiber proportion, while moderate and high volumes decrease the proportion of these fibers. So again, we're seeing higher volumes leading to a decrease in type 2X fibers. And a key detail in this study is that they used sets of 4 fast velocity eccentric half squats at 70% of concentric 1 rep max, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that basically means if your 1 rep max squat was 100 kilos, you'd just be doing 4 fast eccentric reps, so just lowering the weight with 70 kilos, which is nowhere near your 1 rep max. And you could probably do that for like 10 reps. So this is pretty easy. Nowhere near failure. The bar speed is pretty quick and you're not really getting fatigued. And the result of that, the result of fast bar speed, avoiding failure with lower volume, was maintaining type 2X muscle fibers and improving your jumping height and explosiveness much more than moderate or high volume training. So again, avoid failure, use fast velocities with moderate weight, and use low volume. The third tip is to use cluster sets. I hadn't heard much about these before researching for this video. Cluster sets are where you do a high number of sets with low reps in each set and a short rest between sets. So for example, you might do 16 sets of 2 reps with a moderate weight, about your 10 rep max, with a 1 minute rest in between sets. This means that you don't get anywhere near failure because you're only doing 2 reps with your 10 rep max, right? Each set is very easy, and this allows you to use very high velocity reps and to get in lots of total reps over many sets. In this study, the traditional workout was 4 sets of 8 reps, and the cluster workout was 16 sets of 2 reps. And the result of this was max strength increases the same in both types of workout, despite the cluster set not going anywhere near failure or really even struggling at all. But the most important finding is that the lifter's velocity increased much more with cluster sets, probably because you're avoiding the fatigue that you'd normally get from doing the traditional sets. A set of 8 with your 10 rep max is much harder and more fatiguing than a set of 2 with your 10 rep max, obviously. So cluster sets allow you to maintain your high velocity and avoid fatigue. And we know that both of those things are good for preventing or minimizing the loss of type 2X fibers. The fourth point is to avoid long contraction durations. So this in vitro study showed that longer contraction durations cause greater losses in type 2X fibers than shorter contraction durations. Probably because longer contractions lead to more of a buildup of calcium ions in the muscle fiber, which leads to greater fatigue and muscle damage. So this means you probably shouldn't do excessively long eccentric contractions if you want to preserve your type 2X fibers. And long contraction durations are not compatible with high velocities anyway. The fifth point that kind of ties all of the previous points together is just to avoid fatigue. Fatigue seems to be one of the main things that drives the shift from type 2X to type 2A. And this makes sense if you think about it. Type 2X fibers get fatigued very easily. So your body shifts them to fiber types that are more resistant to fatigue so that they don't get overwhelmed if they're challenged again in the future. And by keeping volume low, avoiding failure, and using faster velocities, you minimize fatigue and maintain as many of your type 2X fibers as possible. Number 6 is to not do too much endurance training. As we see in endurance athletes, endurance training leads to shifts towards type 1 muscle fibers, which have lots of mitochondria, so they're very energy efficient and they recover quickly, which makes them good for long distance, low intensity activities. So if you want to avoid this shift towards type 1 fibers, then don't do too much endurance training. I still recommend most people do some low intensity, long duration cardio for health reasons. But if your sport involves max speed or power, then your training should mostly be specific to developing speed or power and not endurance. Maybe limit it to like 1 or just a few endurance sessions per week, about 30 minutes or so at zone 2. Number 7 is a big one. Do some sprints. The data is a bit mixed on sprints, but I think that's probably because of the study designs. There are lots of studies showing that sprinting causes a shift towards type 2A fibers away from type 1, but also away from type 2X. There aren't many studies showing an increase in the proportion of type 2X fibers from sprint training. Like I said, this is probably at least partly because of the design of the training protocols that they use in these studies. Remember that we need high velocity, low volume, and minimal fatigue. Some of these studies involved things like 30-second bike sprints, which are obviously very fatiguing, but others included things like sub 10-second sprints, which still showed a loss of type 2X fibers. Maybe because technically there's still some endurance component in order to keep that speed going, once you're at top speed, for another few seconds. But obviously everyone knows that sprint training will make you faster, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in type 2X fibers. Type 2A fibers are still very capable of producing large forces at fast speeds, just not quite as much as type 2X. So increases in type 2A fibers will still benefit your sprints and your power output. I don't want you to get the impression that type 2A fibers are bad. They're the most versatile kind of fiber, and getting more of them is a good thing for speed and power, at least if it doesn't come at the expense of type 2X fibers. So what kind of sprint training should you be doing specifically for type 2X fibers? Remember that this might not look the same as training for 100 meter or 200 meters because those last a fairly long time, so they involve plenty of type 2A fibers and even some type 1. For type 2X, your sprint training should be high velocity, short duration to avoid fatigue and muscle failure, and low volume, so only a few reps. An example sprint workout might be something like 4 reps of a maximum speed 40-yard dash or 60 meters, but even that is quite long, and you should be recovering fully in between reps, at least like 5 minutes or until you feel fully ready to go. Obviously make sure that you thoroughly warm up before you start this, including some jogging, dynamic stretches, maybe some drills, and then warm up sprints at like 70, 80, 90% of max intensity. and avoid fatigue as much as possible during this workout. And lastly, number 8 is detraining, which is just taking time off. Taking a break from training leads to a shift towards type 2X fibres, and this might provide more support for the theory that fatigue causes shifts towards more oxidative fibres, which are more fatigue resistant. When you take time off and your fatigue comes right down, your proportion of type 2X fibres are increased and your contraction velocity is improved. And this could partly explain why tapers before competitions are useful. Fatigue is lowered, your type 2X fibres are increased even beyond their baseline level in some cases, and the result is increased forced output at high speeds, making you faster and more powerful. And obviously this is good for sprints and power events. So a good rule of thumb to follow: if it's fatiguing, then it's probably shifting your fibres away from type 2X and towards the more fatigue resistant oxidative fibres, type 2A or type 1. So training was the biggest focus of this video, but besides training, you can tweak your diet and recovery to promote as many fast twitch fibres as possible. I won't go into much detail because this video is already long, but here are some things that could help. Supplementing creatine, eating a high protein diet, consuming carbs around your workout, and optionally taking caffeine before your workout. And those two things are basically just to maximize the effectiveness of that workout, because training is probably going to be the main thing that causes these fiber shifts. Optimizing your thyroid hormone will also have an effect on your fiber types, and I'll make a more detailed video about thyroid hormone eventually. And obviously you need to get good sleep and recover properly. Okay, thank you for watching. If you do try out the training principles in this video, let me know how it goes in the comments. You should see some big improvements in things like speed and explosiveness, and these principles will definitely help you with jumping, throwing, and sprint acceleration. Feel free to subscribe and share this video with any friends who also want to become more fast twitch. As you can imagine, these videos take a long time and a lot of effort to make, so if you'd like to support me so I can continue making these videos like this that help you max out your genetic potential, consider leaving a little super thanks, just a few dollars or a few pounds, or you can check out one of my bodybuilding programs or my testosterone optimization guide on Shopify if those are things that you've been taking more seriously recently. Look out for my community posts in your subscriptions feed. I post pretty much every day, and it's a great way for us to connect and discuss things that we're interested in. But other than that, thanks for watching, bro, and I will see you soon.